Hey guys, tonight we're slowing things down with something truly ancient, something that shaped every breath you take, every cell in your body, and even the reason you're lying here trying to fall asleep in the first place. We're talking about evolution, not the textbook version with charts and timelines, but the quiet, beautiful, almost unbelievable stories of how life on Earth became what it is today. Before we begin, if you enjoy these videos, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if it feels right, no pressure. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I love seeing who's drifting off alongside me from across the world. Now, get comfortable, adjust your pillow, maybe dim the lights or turn on that fan for a soft hum in the background. Tonight, we're not rushing anywhere. We're going to explore the slowest, most patient process in the history of the universe, the gradual unfolding of life across billions of years. And somewhere in that story, maybe you'll find the permission to slow down too, to breathe, to rest. Evolution isn't just about dinosaurs or fossils gathering dust in museums. It's about why your heart beats the way it does. Why you crave sugar when you're tired, why your body demands sleep even when your mind resists it. Every quirk of your biology, every instinct, every cell, carries the memory of 4 billion years of trial, error, survival, and adaptation. And here's the thing, you are not separate from this story. You are the story. Your DNA is a library written across deep time, holding instructions refined by countless generations. The rhythm of your breathing, the structure of your bones, the way your brain processes the world, all of it was shaped slowly, patiently, by forces far older than language or civilization. So tonight, we're going to walk through some of the most remarkable chapters in life's history. Not with urgency or drama, but with the calm curiosity they deserve. We'll explore how the first organisms learned to breathe oxygen, even though it nearly killed them. How fish dragged themselves onto land and became the ancestors of everything with a backbone, including you. How tiny mammals survived in the shadows of dinosaurs, waiting for their moment. How your brain grew so large, it now keeps you awake at night, overthinking things that don't matter. Each fact, each evolutionary leap, is a reminder that life doesn't hurry, it doesn't panic. It adapts, it waits, it finds a way, and maybe, just maybe, that's something worth remembering as you try to fall asleep tonight. Let's ease into the journey together. You take around 20,000 breaths every single day without thinking about it. In and out, a rhythm so automatic you only notice it when something goes wrong. But here's something wild. The oxygen you're breathing right now, the gas that keeps you alive, nearly destroyed all life on Earth. It was poison. And the story of how life learned to breathe is one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of the planet. Let's go back, way back. About 3.5 billion years ago, Earth looked nothing like it does now. The sky wasn't blue. It was orange, maybe pink, thick with methane and carbon dioxide. There were no trees, no grass, no animals. Just rock, water, and a few primitive microbes clinging to existence in the ocean, and crucially, there was almost no oxygen in the atmosphere, less than 1% of what we have today. Life at that time didn't need oxygen. In fact, it thrived without it. These early organisms, called anaerobes, survived by breaking down chemicals like hydrogen sulfide and methane. They lived in deep ocean vents, in warm, shallow pools, in places where the sun barely reached. The world was theirs, quiet and toxic and perfectly suited to their biology. Then something happened. Something that would change everything. A tiny organism evolved the ability to do something revolutionary. It could harness sunlight and turn it into energy. This process, which we now call photosynthesis, had one unavoidable side effect. It produced oxygen as waste. These organisms were cyanobacteria, simple single-celled creatures that floated in the oceans and soaked up sunlight. They didn't know they were about to rewrite the rules of life. They just did what they did best, captured light, split water molecules, and released oxygen into the water and eventually into the air. At first, the oxygen didn't accumulate. It reacted with iron dissolved in the ocean, forming rust that sank to the seafloor. You can still see evidence of this today in ancient rock formations called banded iron formations, layers of red and black stone that tell the story of a world slowly filling with oxygen is less than #0. 7 is greater than, but after hundreds of millions of years, something shifted. Around 2.5 billion years ago, the iron in the oceans was used up. There was nothing left to absorb the oxygen, so it began to build up in the atmosphere, slowly at first, then faster. And for most life on Earth, this was catastrophic. Oxygen is a reactive molecule. It wants to bond with other chemicals, sometimes violently. For organisms that had evolved in a world without it, oxygen was corrosive, destructive, deadly. It damaged their cell walls, disrupted their metabolism, and essentially poisoned them from the inside out. This event, known as the Great Oxidation Event, triggered one of the largest mass extinctions in Earth's history. Entire ecosystems collapsed. Species that had dominated the planet for billions of years simply vanished. But here's where evolution gets interesting. Not every organism died. Some survived by retreating to oxygen-free environments, deep ocean floors, underground, places where they could continue living the old way. Their descendants still exist today, hidden in the cracks of the world, thriving in places where oxygen can't reach. Others adapted, and this is the key moment. Some organisms developed ways to not just tolerate oxygen, but to use it. They evolved proteins that could safely handle oxygen molecules, breaking them down in controlled reactions that released energy. This process, called aerobic respiration, was a game changer. It produced far more energy than the old anaerobic methods. Organisms that could breathe oxygen had a massive advantage. They could grow larger, move faster, do more. Over time, these oxygen-breathing organisms diversified and spread. They became the ancestors of nearly every complex life form on Earth today. Plants, animals, fungi, all of us rely on oxygen to power our cells. The mitochondria inside your cells, the tiny structures that generate energy, are actually the descendants of ancient bacteria that learned to breathe. Billions of years ago, they were absorbed by other cells in a partnership that never ended. Now, they're part of you, working every second to keep you alive. So when you take a deep breath before you fall asleep, you're participating in a process that nearly ended life as it existed. You're using a system that evolved from catastrophe, refined over billions of years, passed down through an unbroken chain of survival. Every inhale is a quiet echo of that ancient transformation. And here's the beautiful part. The atmosphere you breathe today, roughly 21% oxygen, was created by living things. Trees, algae, cyanobacteria. They've been pumping oxygen into the air for billions of years. You're not just breathing air. You're breathing life itself, the accumulated exhaust of countless organisms doing what they do best: growing, photosynthesizing, living. The Great Oxidation Event didn't just change the chemistry of the planet, it created the conditions for everything that came after. Without oxygen, there would be no animals, no forests, no you lying here trying to fall asleep. The poison became the foundation. The crisis became the opportunity, and life, patient and relentless, found a way to turn disaster into fuel. The atmosphere transformed, and so did everything living in it. But the story was just beginning, because once life learned to breathe, it could do something it had never done before. It could explode. 540 million years ago, life got creative, very creative. For over 3 billion years, Earth had been home to mostly simple organisms, bacteria, algae, soft-bodied creatures that left almost no trace. Then, in what seems like an evolutionary blink, the oceans exploded with diversity. Complex animals appeared seemingly out of nowhere, armed with shells, claws, eyes, teeth, and body plans so strange they look like something from a fever dream. This moment in history is called the Cambrian Explosion, and it's one of the most dramatic events in the story of life. Before the Cambrian period, the oceans were quiet. Life existed, but it was simple. Sponges clung to rocks. Soft jellyfish-like creatures drifted in the currents. Worms burrowed through the seafloor. These organisms had no hard parts, no bones or shells, so they rarely fossilized. What we know about them comes from rare impressions in ancient stone, ghostly outlines of bodies long dissolved. It was a world of soft things in soft places, slow and undefended. But around 545 million years ago, something changed. The fossil record, which had been sparse and quiet for billions of years, suddenly fills with life. Trilobites appear, armored arthropods with segmented bodies and compound eyes. Brachiopods emerge, shelled creatures that filter food from the water. Mollusks, the ancestors of snails and squids, begin building protective casings. In the span of just 20 to 25 million years, nearly every major animal group we see today, or their close ancestors, appeared in the oceans. Why did this happen? Scientists have debated this for decades, and the answer is likely a combination of factors. One theory points to rising oxygen levels. By the late Precambrian, oxygen in the atmosphere had reached levels high enough to support larger, more active bodies. More oxygen meant more energy, and more energy meant animals could grow bigger, move faster, and build complex structures like eyes and limbs. Another factor was the evolution of predation. Before the Cambrian, most organisms were grazers or filter feeders, passively collecting nutrients. But once some animals developed the ability to hunt and eat others, everything changed. Suddenly, being soft and slow was a death sentence. An evolutionary arms race began. Prey evolved shells, spines, and armor to protect themselves. Predators evolved claws, jaws, and better senses to catch them. Each adaptation pushed the other side to adapt further, faster. This is where things get weird. The Cambrian seas were filled with creatures that looked like they were designed by a committee that couldn't agree on anything. Take Anomalocaris, for example. It was one of the top predators of its time, growing up to 3 feet long, which made it a giant compared to most other animals. It had a circular mouth lined with plates that could crush shells, 2 large eyes on stalks, and grasping appendages near its head that looked like shrimp tails. It swam through the water like a nightmarish squid, hunting trilobites and anything else it could catch. Then there was Opabinia, a creature so bizarre that when scientists first presented it at a conference, the audience laughed. It had 5 eyes arranged across its head, a long, flexible proboscis with a claw at the end for grabbing prey, and a segmented body with lobed fins. It looked like someone took parts from 5 different animals and stitched them together, but it worked. Opabinia was a successful predator, patrolling the seafloor and snatching up small worms. And then there's Hallucigenia, which was named that way for a reason. When paleontologists first reconstructed it, they put it upside down and backwards. It has 7 pairs of spines along its back, 7 pairs of legs underneath, and a tube-like body with no clear head or tail. Even now, after decades of study, it still looks like something that shouldn't exist, but it did, and it thrived. What's remarkable about the Cambrian explosion isn't just the sudden appearance of diversity. It's that these animals were experimenting with body plans, trying out different designs to see what worked. Some had exoskeletons, some had internal supports, some had radial symmetry, like starfish, others had bilateral symmetry, like us. Evolution was testing ideas, and the ocean became a laboratory. One of the most important innovations to come out of this period was vision. The first complex eyes appeared in the Cambrian, particularly in trilobites and anomalocarids. Before this, organisms sensed light and dark, but they couldn't see shapes or track movement. Eyes changed everything. Predators could spot prey from a distance. Prey could see predators coming and flee. The development of vision accelerated the arms race even further, creating pressure to move faster, hide better, and develop more sophisticated strategies. Another crucial development was biomineralization, the ability to build hard structures like shells and skeletons. Before the Cambrian, most animals were soft and vulnerable, but once organisms figured out how to extract calcium carbonate or silica from seawater and use it to build protective armor, survival rates increased. Shells didn't just protect. They also provided anchor points for muscles, allowing animals to move more powerfully and efficiently. This innovation opened the door for larger, more complex body structures. The Cambrian explosion also gave rise to the chordates, the group that includes all vertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, you. Early chordates like Picaia were small, eel-like creatures with a flexible rod running down their backs called a notochord. This simple structure would eventually evolve into the spine, one of the most important adaptations in animal history. Without Picaia and its relatives, there would be no fish, no dinosaurs, no humans lying in bed scrolling through sleep videos. By the end of the Cambrian period, about 485 million years ago, the ocean was unrecognizable from what it had been before. Complex ecosystems had formed with predators, prey, scavengers, and filter feeders all interacting in intricate food webs, the basic body plans that define animal life today. Segmented bodies, jointed limbs, centralized nervous systems, hard shells, were all present. In just 25 million years, the blueprint for modern animals was written, and what followed wasn't random. It was refinement, adaptation, survival. The Cambrian gave life the tools it needed to conquer every environment on Earth. Next up, one of those tools would prove especially useful: a backbone. Your spine holds you upright. It protects your spinal cord, supports your skull, and lets you twist, bend, and move through the world with precision. Right now, as you lie in bed, it's probably reminding you it exists, maybe with a dull ache between your shoulder blades or a twinge in your lower back. But here's the thing. That column of bone didn't start on land. It started in the ocean as something much simpler, much softer. And the story of how you got a backbone is one of the most important chapters in evolutionary history. Let's rewind to the Cambrian seas around 520 million years ago. Most animals at this time had one of two strategies. Either they built hard external shells like trilobites and mollusks, or they stayed soft and flexible like worms and jellyfish. But there was a third group quietly emerging, one that would eventually give rise to every fish, frog, lizard, bird, and mammal on Earth. These were the chordates. Early chordates were small, unassuming creatures. They didn't have bones, they didn't have jaws. They weren't apex predators or armored tanks, but they had something unique, a flexible rod running down the length of their bodies called a notochord. This structure was made of cartilage, the same material that makes up your nose and ears, and it provided just enough support to let these animals swim with purpose and control. One of the earliest known chordates is a little creature called Pikaia, discovered in the Burgess Shale fossil beds in Canada. Pikaia was only about 2 inches long, shaped like a flattened eel, with a series of V-shaped muscles along its sides. When those muscles contracted, the notochord would bend, pushing the animal forward through the water. It wasn't fast, it wasn't powerful, but it worked. And more importantly, it was efficient. The notochord gave chordates an advantage over other soft-bodied animals. Worms, for example, moved by squeezing and stretching their entire bodies, which required a lot of energy and didn't produce much speed. Chordates, on the other hand, could generate focused, directed movement. They could dart away from predators, chase down prey, and navigate complex environments with more control. That simple rod of cartilage was the foundation for everything that came next. But having a notochord wasn't enough. The real breakthrough came when some chordates began to develop additional supports around that central rod, small plates of cartilage that protected the nerve cord running along the back. Over millions of years, these plates became more structured, more rigid. Eventually, they turned into something revolutionary: vertebrae. The first true vertebrates appeared around 500 million years ago. These were jawless fish, similar to modern lampreys and hagfish. They didn't look like much. No scales, no fins, no teeth, just elongated bodies with a series of bony segments running down their backs. But those segments, those vertebrae, changed the game. They provided structure without sacrificing flexibility. They protected the spinal cord from injury, and they gave muscles something solid to pull against, which made movement faster and more powerful. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to row a boat made of rubber. Every time you pull the oars, the boat bends and flexes, and most of your effort is wasted. Now imagine the same boat made of wood. They turned soft, flexible bodies into precision swimming machines. As vertebrates diversified, the spine became more specialized. Some fish developed longer, more flexible spines for rapid twisting and turning. Others developed shorter, thicker spines for powerful bursts of speed. The spine wasn't just a support structure anymore. It was an evolutionary toolkit, adaptable to different lifestyles and environments. Then came the next big leap. Around 375 million years ago, some fish began venturing into shallow water and eventually onto land. These were the early tetrapods, and they faced a problem. Water supports your body weight. Land doesn't. In the ocean, a flexible spine was an asset. On land, It needed to be strong enough to hold the body up against gravity. The solution was to modify the spine yet again. Vertebrae became thicker and more interlocking, with bony projections that limited how much the spine could bend. This made the spine more rigid, which was necessary for supporting weight, but it also reduced flexibility. Walking, it turns out, requires a different kind of spine than swimming. As tetrapods evolved into amphibians, then reptiles, then mammals, the spine kept changing. In reptiles, the spine is relatively uniform, with each vertebra looking similar to the next. But in mammals, the spine became regionalized. The neck vertebrae, called cervical vertebrae, are different from the chest vertebrae, which are different from the lower back vertebrae, which are different from the tailbone. Each section is specialized for a specific function. Your neck vertebrae allow you to turn your head. Your thoracic vertebrae anchor your ribs and protect your heart and lungs. Your lumbar vertebrae bear the weight of your upper body. And your sacrum connects your spine to your pelvis, distributing force when you walk or run. This regionalization is one of the reasons mammals are so adaptable. A giraffe has the same number of neck vertebrae as you do, 7, but each one is stretched and modified to support that long neck. A whale's spine is flexible and streamlined for swimming. A cheetah's spine acts like a coiled spring, extending and compressing with each stride to maximize speed. Same basic structure, endless variations. But here's the cost. The human spine, in particular, is a compromise. We walk upright, which requires a spine that can support weight vertically, but our spines evolved from ancestors that walked on all fours. The result is a structure that's prone to problems. Lower back pain, herniated discs, pinched nerves. These are the trade-offs of standing up. Your spine is doing its best, but it's working with an ancient design that was never meant to hold you vertical for hours at a time. Still, that spine, with all its quirks and vulnerabilities, is a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering. It's been refined over 500 million years, tested in oceans, rivers, forests, and deserts. It's flexible enough to let you bend and twist, strong enough to hold you upright, and precise enough to protect the delicate nerve tissue inside. That column of bone you sleep on, the one that aches after a long day, is over 500 million years old. It carries the memory of ancient seas, the first stumbling steps onto land, and every creature that came before you, and soon that very spine would help its owners do something extraordinary. Your arms and legs were once fins, and the move from water to land was brutal. Imagine trying to breathe air for the first time when your whole body is designed for extracting oxygen from water. Imagine dragging yourself across mud with limbs that aren't quite legs yet, gasping, struggling, vulnerable to every predator and every harsh ray of sunlight. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't easy, but it happened, and the fossils tell us exactly how. Around 375 million years ago, during a period called the Devonian, fish ruled the waters. The oceans and rivers were filled with armored giants, swift predators, and everything in between. But some shallow coastal environments were becoming difficult places to live. The water was warm, stagnant, low in oxygen. Droughts would come and go, leaving isolated pools that shrank under the sun. Fish that could survive in these harsh conditions had an advantage. Some fish began developing lungs, simple air sacs that allowed them to gulp oxygen from the surface when the water got too oxygen poor. These weren't the first lungs. Lungfish, which still exist today, had already been using them for millions of years. But what made certain fish special wasn't just the ability to breathe air, it was what they did with their fins. Most fish have fins supported by thin, flexible rays, perfect for steering and propulsion in water. But a group of fish called lobe-finned fish had something different. Their fins contained bones, thick, sturdy bones arranged in a pattern that looked almost like an arm or a leg. There was one bone close to the body, similar to your humerus or femur, then two bones further out, like your radius and ulna, or tibia and fibula, and then smaller bones at the end, the beginnings of what would eventually become fingers and toes. These bony fins weren't designed for walking, they were designed for pushing through dense underwater vegetation, propping the fish up on the bottom of shallow pools, or even dragging the body short distances across mudflats to reach deeper water. But evolution doesn't plan ahead, it works with what's available, and these fins, strong and jointed, turned out to be adapted for something much bigger, moving onto land. The most famous example of this transition is a fossil called Tiktaalik, discovered in the Canadian Arctic in 2004. Tiktaalik lived about 375 million years ago, and it sits right at the boundary between fish and tetrapod, the four-limbed animals that would eventually conquer the land. It had scales, fins, and gills like a fish. But it also had a flat head with eyes on top, a neck that could move independently from its shoulders, and robust, bony fins that could support its weight. Tiktaalik probably spent most of its time in shallow water, using its muscular fins to prop itself up and peer above the surface. It could breathe air through primitive lungs and possibly through its skin. It wasn't walking yet, not really, but it was doing something close. It was hauling itself through the shallows, navigating a world that was part water, part land, and that was enough. Why leave the water at all? The answer comes down to survival and opportunity. Shallow, oxygen-poor water was a tough place to live, but the land was full of resources. There were insects, worms, and other invertebrates crawling along the shore. There were plants taking root in the mud, and most importantly, there were no competitors. No fish had figured out how to live on land full-time. The first animals to make that leap would have an entire ecosystem to themselves. But moving onto land required more than just strong fins. It required a completely new way of breathing. In water, fish extract oxygen by passing water over their gills, thin membranes filled with blood vessels. But gills collapse in air. They need to be supported by water to function. So fish that wanted to spend time on land needed lungs that could expand and contract, pulling air in and pushing it out. Tiktaalik and its relatives had simple lungs, not nearly as efficient as yours, but functional enough to supplement their gills when oxygen was scarce. Over millions of years, these fish-like creatures spent more and more time on land. Their fins became stronger, more weight-bearing. The bones inside thickened and elongated. Joints became more flexible, allowing for a greater range of motion. Slowly, awkwardly, fins transformed into limbs. By about 360 million years ago, true tetrapods had emerged. These were creatures like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, which had 4 limbs with digits, recognizable fingers and toes. But here's the interesting part. These early tetrapods didn't abandon the water. Acanthostega, for example, had 8 digits on each limb and gills that suggest it still spent most of its time in water. Its limbs were probably used for walking along the bottom of rivers or pulling itself through thick vegetation, not for walking on dry land. It was still transitioning, still figuring out how to balance between two worlds. Walking on land is harder than it looks. In water, buoyancy supports your weight. On land, gravity pulls you down with every step. Early tetrapods had to develop stronger bones, more powerful muscles, and a completely different way of moving. Instead of the side-to-side undulation of a fish, they had to learn to swing their limbs forward and back, coordinating 4 legs in a rhythm that wouldn't tip them over. It was clumsy at first. They waddled, dragged their bellies, and probably tired quickly. But they kept trying. By around 340 million years ago, tetrapods had fully committed to life on land. They developed thicker skin to prevent water loss, better lungs for sustained breathing, and more efficient limbs for walking and running. Their eyes adapted to see in air instead of water. Their ears developed structures to detect sound vibrations traveling through air rather than water. Every system in their bodies had to be redesigned, piece by piece, for a new environment. And it worked. Once tetrapods mastered the land, they diversified rapidly. Amphibians spread across the continents. Some stayed close to water, laying their eggs in ponds and rivers. Others ventured further inland, evolving into reptiles that could survive in dry environments. From those reptiles came dinosaurs, birds, and eventually mammals. Every terrestrial vertebrate, every lizard, every bird, every mammal, every creature with 4 limbs or the remnants of 4 limbs traces its ancestry back to those early tetrapods that dragged themselves out of the water. Your arms, the ones folded under your pillow right now, are modified fins. Your legs, stretched out under the covers, are the descendants of bony lobes that once pushed through ancient mud. The joints in your wrists and ankles, the bones in your fingers and toes, all of it is a repurposed toolkit, built first for water, then adapted for land. Walking wasn't elegant at first, but it was survival. And survival, as always, was enough to keep evolution moving forward. But the tetrapods that conquered the land would soon face a world that was about to get much, much bigger. Imagine dragonflies the size of hawks, millipedes as long as cars, spiders with leg spans that could cover your face. The past was huge. Not just dinosaurs, but insects, arthropods, creatures that today are small and manageable, but back then were the stuff of nightmares. And this wasn't science fiction, it was real. For tens of millions of years, Earth was a planet of giants. And the reason why has everything to do with the air you're breathing right now. We're talking about the Carboniferous period, roughly 360 to 300 million years ago. If you could step into that world, the first thing you'd notice after the giant bugs would be the forests. But these weren't forests like the ones we know today. There were no flowering plants, no grasses, no oak or maple trees. Instead, the land was covered in towering ferns, massive club mosses called lepidodendron that grew over 100 feet tall, and giant horsetails that looked like bamboo on steroids. These plants thrived in warm, swampy lowlands that stretched across much of the supercontinent Pangaea, and they did what plants do best. They photosynthesized. They pulled carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and released oxygen as a byproduct. Normally, when plants die, they decompose. Bacteria and fungi break down the organic matter, releasing that carbon back into the air. But during the Carboniferous, something unusual happened. The fungi and bacteria that decompose wood hadn't fully evolved yet. They couldn't break down lignin. The tough compound that gives wood its strength is less than #0. 7# is greater than. So, when these massive trees died, they didn't rot. They just piled up. Layer upon layer of dead plant matter accumulated in swamps, getting buried under sediment, compressed over millions of years. That's where coal comes from. The Carboniferous period is literally named after carbon, because this was when most of Earth's coal deposits were formed. And all that undecomposed plant matter meant one thing. The carbon stayed locked in the ground, and the oxygen kept building up in the atmosphere. Oxygen levels during the Carboniferous reached about 35% of the atmosphere, compared to 21% today. That might not sound like a huge difference, but it had massive consequences. More oxygen meant more energy. And for insects and other arthropods, which don't have lungs but instead breathe through tiny tubes called tracheae, more oxygen meant they could grow much, much larger. Here's why. Insect bodies rely on passive diffusion to deliver oxygen to their cells. Air enters through small openings called spiracles and travels through a network of tracheae that branch throughout the body. This system works fine for small insects, but it has a size limit. The larger you get, the harder it is for oxygen to diffuse deep into your tissues. In today's atmosphere, that limit keeps most insects relatively small. But in the oxygen-rich Carboniferous, that limit was pushed way, way up. Enter Meganeura, the giant dragonfly. With a wingspan of over 2 feet, it was one of the largest flying insects ever to exist. It soared through the humid air of Carboniferous swamps, hunting smaller insects and possibly even small amphibians. Its huge eyes, made up of thousands of individual lenses, gave it exceptional vision. Its powerful flight muscles, fueled by abundant oxygen, allowed it to hover, dart, and maneuver with terrifying precision. If you saw one today, you'd probably run. Then there was Arthropleura, a millipede that could grow over 8 feet long. Imagine a creature the size of a human lying down, covered in armored segments, crawling through the undergrowth. Arthropleura was likely an herbivore, feeding on decaying plant matter and fungi, but its sheer size would have made it nearly invulnerable to most predators. Fossils of Arthropleura have been found with trackways showing where they moved through ancient mud, leaving behind impressions that are both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Spiders got bigger too. Some arachnids from this period had leg spans approaching a foot. Scorpions reached lengths of over 2 feet. Even mayflies, which today live for just a day or two as adults, grew to enormous sizes. The Carboniferous was a time when being an arthropod meant being a giant, or at least having the potential to be one. But it wasn't just about oxygen. The environment itself supported gigantism. The warm, humid climate was stable. Food was abundant. The forests were dense with plant matter, and the swamps were rich with organic material. There were few large vertebrate predators yet. Amphibians were around, but they were still relatively small and mostly aquatic. The land was wide open for arthropods to dominate. So why don't we have giant insects today? What changed? The answer is oxygen levels dropped. By the end of the Carboniferous, fungi and bacteria had finally evolved the ability to break down lignin. Dead trees started decomposing properly, releasing carbon back into the atmosphere and reducing the production of oxygen. Over millions of years, oxygen levels fell back down to the 21% we have today. And as oxygen declined, so did the maximum size of insects. But that's not the only reason. Vertebrates got bigger and smarter. By the time the Carboniferous ended and the Permian period began, reptiles had evolved and started spreading across the land. These early reptiles were predators, and they were good at it. They had jaws, teeth, speed, and most importantly, they could regulate their body temperature better than amphibians. Giant insects, with their slow metabolisms and limited mobility on the ground, became easy targets. Predation pressure kept insect sizes in check. There's also the issue of flight. Birds and pterosaurs would eventually dominate the skies, and they were far more efficient flyers than insects. A giant dragonfly might have ruled the Carboniferous air, but it couldn't compete with a bird. Birds have lungs that actively pump air, providing a constant supply of oxygen. Insects rely on passive diffusion, which becomes inefficient at larger sizes, especially in lower oxygen environments. Once birds appeared, the age of giant flying insects was over. Even the structure of insect bodies worked against them as they grew larger. Exoskeletons are great for small creatures, but they don't scale well. The bigger you get, the thicker your exoskeleton needs to be to support your weight. At a certain point, the exoskeleton becomes so heavy that it's more burden than benefit. Vertebrates, with internal skeletons, don't have this problem. Bones can grow thicker and stronger without adding too much weight, especially since they're supported by muscles and connective tissue. So the giants fell. Oxygen levels dropped, predators evolved, and the ecosystems that had supported these enormous arthropods disappeared. But their descendants remain. Every dragonfly you see hovering over a pond, every millipede curling up under a rock, every spider spinning a web in the corner of your room, they're all echoes of those ancient giants. Smaller now, adapted to a world with less oxygen and more competition, but still here, still surviving. The giants fell, but their descendants remain, smaller and quieter. And the world they left behind was about to face something far worse than a drop in oxygen. It was about to face near total annihilation. 252 million years ago, life on Earth almost ended. Not slowly, not gradually, but in a catastrophic collapse that wiped out 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. It was the closest life has ever come to complete extinction. If you think about how fragile existence is, how easily everything you know could disappear, this event is a reminder. Life is resilient, but it's not invincible. And what happened during the Permian mass extinction changed the trajectory of evolution forever. Before the extinction, the Permian period was a time of relative stability. The supercontinent Pangaea had fully formed, bringing all of Earth's land masses together into one massive block. The oceans were teeming with life. Coral reefs stretched across shallow seas, home to brachiopods, crinoids, and trilobites that had survived for hundreds of millions of years. On land, reptiles had diversified into an array of forms. Some were small and lizard-like, others were large herbivores with sprawling limbs, and a group called synapsids, the ancestors of mammals, were beginning to dominate. The climate was warm, but not unbearably so. Forests covered parts of the interior, though much of Pangaea's center was arid desert. Life had adapted to these conditions. Ecosystems were complex, interconnected, functioning. Everything seemed fine. And then everything went wrong. The trigger was volcanic. In what is now Siberia, a series of massive eruptions began. But these weren't ordinary volcanoes. They were flood basalts, where magma wells up from deep within the earth and spreads across the surface in vast sheets. The Siberian traps, as they're called today, erupted for nearly 1 million years, covering an area the size of Europe with lava up to 2 miles thick in some places. The sheer volume of molten rock was incomprehensible. But the lava itself wasn't the main problem. It was what came with it. The eruptions released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and methane into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It traps heat. As CO2 levels skyrocketed, global temperatures began to rise. Some estimates suggest temperatures increased by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. That might not sound catastrophic, but for ecosystems already adapted to specific temperature ranges, it was devastating. Warmer temperatures had a cascade of effects. Oceans absorbed much of the excess CO2, which made them more acidic. Acidic water dissolves calcium carbonate, the material that shellfish and corals use to build their skeletons. Reefs began to die. Shelled organisms couldn't maintain their structures. Entire marine ecosystems collapsed as the foundation species disappeared. At the same time, warmer water holds less oxygen. As ocean temperatures rose, oxygen levels dropped. This created hypoxic zones, areas where the water was so oxygen poor that most animals couldn't survive. Fish suffocated. Bottom-dwelling creatures died in massive numbers. The oceans, once vibrant and full of life, became graveyards. On land, the effects were just as severe. Forests died as temperatures soared and rainfall patterns shifted. Plants that had thrived in cooler, wetter conditions couldn't adapt fast enough. Herbivores that depended on those plants starved. Predators that depended on those herbivores starved. Food chains broke down from the bottom up. But there was another factor, one that may have been even more deadly. The volcanic eruptions released massive amounts of methane, either directly from magma or by heating coal and oil deposits underground. Methane is a greenhouse gas far more potent than carbon dioxide, and it amplified the warming effect. Some scientists believe methane bursts from the ocean floor, triggered by warming water, may have added even more methane to the atmosphere in a feedback loop that accelerated the disaster. The result was a world on fire. Literally, evidence suggests that wildfires raged across the continents, consuming what remained of the forests. Charcoal deposits from this time are found in rock layers all over the world. The air was filled with ash, sulfur, and toxic gases. Breathing itself became difficult for many species. The extinction unfolded over tens of thousands of years, maybe longer. It wasn't a single event, but a prolonged crisis. Species that survived the initial warming died in the acidified oceans. Species that survived the fires died from starvation. And species that survived all of that still faced a world that was fundamentally altered. A world where the rules of survival had changed completely. Trilobites, which had existed for over 270 million years, went extinct. Not a single species survived. Coral reefs disappeared entirely and wouldn't recover for millions of years. The vast majority of marine invertebrates vanished. On land, large herbivores and apex predators died out. Entire ecosystems were erased. But not everything died, and this is where the story turns from tragedy to resilience. Among the survivors were small, adaptable creatures, reptiles that could burrow underground to escape the heat, amphibians that could survive in isolated water sources, and most importantly, a few small synapsids, mammal-like reptiles that would eventually give rise to true mammals. These survivors weren't the strongest or the largest. They were the most adaptable. They could tolerate a wider range of temperatures. They could survive on less food. They reproduced quickly, which allowed them to evolve rapidly in response to changing conditions. In the aftermath of the extinction, as the planet slowly began to stabilize, these creatures moved into the empty niches left by the dead. One group that thrived in the post-Permian world was the archosaurs. the ancestors of dinosaurs and crocodiles. They were relatively small at first, but they had efficient respiratory systems, strong limbs, and adaptable diets. Over the next several million years, they would diversify and eventually dominate the Triassic period. Without the Permian extinction clearing the way, dinosaurs might never have risen to power. The recovery was slow. It took 5 to 10 million years for biodiversity to return to pre-extinction levels. Coral reefs didn't fully recover until the Triassic, and even then, they were built by different species than before. The world that emerged from the Permian was unrecognizable from the world that entered it. Old dynasties had fallen, new ones were just beginning. The Permian mass extinction is a sobering reminder of how quickly things can change. Life had existed on Earth for over 3 billion years by that point. It had survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, and countless smaller extinctions. But the Permian came closer than anything else to ending it all. And the reason it didn't wasn't because life was invincible. It was because a few species, out of sheer luck or sheer adaptability, managed to hold on. You are descended from those survivors. The mammals that exist today, including you, trace their ancestry back to the small, scrappy synapsids that endured the worst catastrophe in Earth's history. They didn't know they were survivors, they were just trying to live another day, but that was enough. The Earth recovered slowly, but it was never the same. And in the quiet that followed, in the empty landscapes and the recovering oceans, something new was stirring. Something that would grow larger, faster, and more dominant than anything that had come before. The age of the dinosaurs was about to begin. For 170 million years, dinosaurs were Earth's dominant life form. To put that in perspective, modern humans have existed for only about 300,000 years. We've been around for less than 1% of the time dinosaurs ruled the planet. They weren't a brief experiment or an evolutionary dead end. They were the most successful large animals in the history of Earth. And their story, from humble beginnings to absolute dominance, is one of adaptation, innovation, and sheer endurance. The age of dinosaurs began in the aftermath of the Permian mass extinction. The world was still recovering, ecosystems were rebuilding, and the survivors were slowly filling the empty niches left behind. During the early Triassic period, around 250 million years ago, reptiles were diversifying rapidly. Some became large herbivores. Others became predators. And one group, the archosaurs, began developing features that would set them apart from everything else. Archosaurs had a few key advantages. Their legs were positioned more directly under their bodies, rather than sprawling out to the sides like most reptiles. This gave them better posture and more efficient movement. They could run faster, for longer distances, and with less energy expenditure. They also had more efficient lungs, with air sacs that allowed continuous airflow, similar to modern birds. This meant they could sustain high levels of activity without tiring as quickly as other reptiles. The first true dinosaurs appeared around 230 million years ago during the middle of the Triassic. They were small, bipedal creatures, no larger than a dog. Eoraptor, one of the earliest known dinosaurs, was only about 3 feet long and weighed around 20 pounds. It had sharp teeth, clawed hands, and long legs built for speed. It was a carnivore, likely hunting small reptiles, insects, and other prey in the forests and plains of what is now Argentina. At first, dinosaurs were not dominant. They shared the landscape with other archosaurs, including crocodile relatives that were much larger and more formidable. But dinosaurs had something special. They reproduced quickly, adapted rapidly, and could exploit a wide range of ecological niches. And then, another extinction event struck at the end of the Triassic, around 201 million years ago. This extinction wasn't as severe as the Permian, but it was enough to wipe out many of the large reptiles that had been competing with dinosaurs. With their competition gone, dinosaurs exploded in diversity by the Jurassic period, which began around 200 million years ago. They had spread across every continent. They evolved into an astonishing variety of forms. Some became massive herbivores, the sauropods, with long necks that allowed them to reach vegetation other animals couldn't access. Others became swift, agile predators. Some developed armor and defensive weapons. Others took to the skies, evolving into the first birds. Let's talk about the giants. Sauropods like Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, and Argentinosaurus were the largest land animals that ever lived. Brachiosaurus could reach heights of over 40 feet, with a neck so long it could graze from the tops of trees like a living crane. Argentinosaurus, one of the largest dinosaurs ever discovered, may have weighed over 70 tons. That's heavier than 10 elephants combined. How did they get so big? Several factors played a role. First, their respiratory system was incredibly efficient. Like modern birds, sauropods had air sacs connected to their lungs that allowed air to flow in one direction continuously. This meant they could extract more oxygen from each breath, which is crucial for sustaining a massive body. Second, their bones were pneumatic, meaning they had hollow spaces filled with air. This reduced their overall weight without sacrificing strength, similar to how a steel beam with a hollow core is lighter but still structurally sound. Third, they were herbivores. Plants are abundant and relatively easy to access compared to prey, which means herbivores can spend most of their time eating without expending energy on hunting. Sauropods had long necks that acted like biological cranes, allowing them to reach high vegetation and cover large areas without moving their massive bodies much. And fourth, they reproduced by laying eggs. Giving birth to live young would have been impossible at that size, but eggs allowed even the largest sauropods to start small and grow over decades. But not all dinosaurs were giants. The Jurassic and Cretaceous periods also saw the rise of theropods, the carnivorous dinosaurs that include some of the most famous predators in history. Allosaurus, a top predator of the late Jurassic, was around 30 feet long and weighed about 2 tons. It hunted in packs, using coordinated attacks to bring down prey much larger than itself. Fossils show evidence of healed injuries, suggesting these animals survived violent encounters and lived to hunt again. Then came the Cretaceous period, from 145 to 66 million years ago, and with it, the most iconic dinosaur of all, Tyrannosaurus rex, T. Rex was a 40-foot-long, 9-ton apex predator with jaws capable of exerting over 12,000 pounds of force per square inch. Its teeth were the size of bananas, serrated like steak knives, designed to crush bone and tear flesh. It had forward-facing eyes, which gave it binocular vision and depth perception, crucial for a predator. And despite its massive size, recent studies suggest T. Rex could move quickly, at least in short bursts, possibly reaching speeds of 15 to 20 miles per hour. But dinosaurs weren't just about size and strength. They were also surprisingly intelligent and social. Fossil evidence shows that many species engaged in complex behaviors. Some built nests and cared for their young, protecting eggs and feeding hatchlings until they could fend for themselves. Maiasaura, whose name means good mother lizard, was discovered with nests full of eggs and juveniles, suggesting extended parental care. Other dinosaurs lived in herds. Fossilized trackways show groups of sauropods moving together, with smaller juveniles protected in the center of the herd. Some theropods, like Deinonychus, likely hunted in coordinated packs, using strategy and teamwork to take down prey. These weren't mindless reptiles. They were sophisticated animals with social structures, communication, and learned behaviors. Dinosaurs also adapted to every environment on Earth. They lived in forests, deserts, swamps, and even polar regions. Fossils of dinosaurs have been found in Antarctica, suggesting that some species could tolerate cold climates, possibly by migrating or developing insulating feathers. Yes, feathers. We now know that many theropods, including the ancestors of birds, were covered in feathers, not for flight, at least not at first, but for insulation and display. Some dinosaurs had vibrant plumage used to attract mates or intimidate rivals. For over 170 million years, dinosaurs dominated the planet. They survived climate changes, volcanic eruptions, and shifting continents. They evolved into thousands of species, filling every ecological niche available to large land animals. They were fast, powerful, intelligent, and adaptable. They seemed unstoppable. And then, in a single day, their world ended. They ruled longer than any mammal ever has, and they didn't see the end coming. But the sky was about to fall, and with it, the age of giants would close forever. 66 million years ago, a rock 6 miles wide ended an era. It wasn't a slow decline or a gradual shift in climate. It was instant, violent, and absolute. One moment, dinosaurs were the undisputed rulers of Earth. The next, they were fighting for survival in a world that had turned hostile in the span of hours. This is the story of the day the sky fell, and how a single impact reshaped the entire trajectory of life on this planet. The asteroid came from the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, a fragment of rock that had been drifting through space for billions of years. It was traveling at roughly 45,000 miles per hour when it entered Earth's atmosphere. There was no warning, no time to prepare. It struck the shallow waters off the coast of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, creating a crater over 100 miles wide and 12 miles deep. The impact site is called Chicxulub, named after a nearby town, and it remains one of the most studied geological features on Earth. The energy released by the impact was unimaginable. Estimates suggest it was equivalent to 10 billion Hiroshima bombs detonating simultaneously. The ground didn't just shake. The crust of the Earth rippled outward in waves, like dropping a stone into water, except the water was solid rock moving at supersonic speeds. Everything within hundreds of miles was obliterated instantly, vaporized by the heat and pressure of the impact. But the destruction didn't stop there. The impact sent a shockwave through the atmosphere that flattened forests across entire continents. Trees, thousands of miles away, were knocked over like dominoes. The shockwave was followed by a blast of superheated air that ignited wildfires across North and South America. Within hours, vast stretches of vegetation were burning. Smoke and ash billowed into the sky, choking the air and blocking out the sun. The asteroid hit shallow water, which meant it vaporized not just rock but also large amounts of seawater. This created massive tsunamis that radiated outward in all directions. Waves, over 300 feet tall, crashed into coastlines, flooding inland areas and drowning anything that couldn't escape to higher ground. Fossils from this time show marine creatures washed miles inland, mixed with terrestrial animals in chaotic deposits that tell the story of a world turned upside down. The impact also ejected trillions of tons of material into the atmosphere. Molten rock, vaporized stone, and debris were launched into space, some of it reaching altitudes where it began to fall back to Earth as flaming meteors. This created a secondary rain of fire that ignited even more wildfires. The sky would have glowed red, filled with streaks of burning rock. For animals on the ground, there was nowhere to hide. The air itself was deadly, filled with toxic gases, superheated steam, and choking dust. But the immediate effects, as catastrophic as they were only the beginning. The real killer came in the weeks and months that followed. The asteroid impact threw so much dust and ash into the atmosphere that it blocked out the sun. This is known as an impact winter. Temperatures plummeted, photosynthesis stopped. Plants, which rely on sunlight to produce energy, began to die. Without plants, herbivores starved. Without herbivores, carnivores starved. The entire food chain collapsed from the bottom up. In the oceans, the situation was equally dire. The impact caused massive acidification as sulfur and other chemicals dissolved into the water. Plankton, the microscopic organisms that form the base of the marine food web, died in enormous numbers. Fish, marine reptiles, and invertebrates followed. Ammonites, shelled cephalopods that had thrived for hundreds of millions of years, went extinct. Mosasaurs, massive marine predators, disappeared. Even the plesiosaurs, which had ruled the seas for over 100 million years, vanished. Estimates suggest that around 75% of all species on Earth went extinct within a relatively short period after the impact. Some died in the initial blast and fires, others died in the months of darkness that followed, and many died in the years of cold, starvation, and ecological collapse that defined the post-impact world. It was one of the 5 major mass extinctions in Earth's history, and it marked the end of the Mesozoic era, the age of reptiles. Dinosaurs, which had dominated for 170 million years, were almost completely wiped out. The large dinosaurs went extinct first. Sauropods, the giants that had towered over the landscape, couldn't find enough food to sustain their massive bodies. Theropods, the predators, lost their prey and starved. Herbivorous dinosaurs like Triceratops and Ankylosaurus, which had thrived in lush forests, found themselves in a world without vegetation. But not all dinosaurs died. A small group of theropods, the avian dinosaurs, survived. These were the ancestors of modern birds. They were small, feathered, and adaptable. They could fly, which allowed them to cover large distances in search of food. They could eat seeds, which remained viable even after plants died, and they could survive in a variety of environments. While their larger relatives perished, these small dinosaurs endured. Why did some species survive while others didn't? Size was a major factor. Smaller animals needed less food and could survive on whatever scraps remained. Burrowing animals, like early mammals and some reptiles, could escape the fires and the cold by staying underground. Aquatic animals that could tolerate murky, oxygen-poor water had a better chance than those that needed clear, warm seas. And generalists, animals that could eat a variety of foods, fared better than specialists that relied on specific plants or prey. Crocodilians survived, likely because they could go long periods without eating and could live in both water and on land. Turtles, with their protective shells and slow metabolisms, made it through. Amphibians. which could survive in isolated pockets of water, endured. And mammals, small nocturnal creatures that had spent the age of dinosaurs hiding in burrows and shadows. The recovery was slow. For thousands of years, the earth remained dark and cold. Fungal blooms spread across the dead forests, feeding on decaying plant matter. The fossil record from this time shows an unusual abundance of fungal spores, evidence of a world dominated by decomposition. But eventually, the dust settled, the sun broke through, and life, as it always does, began to rebuild. Plants were the first to recover. Seeds that had lain dormant in the soil began to sprout. Ferns, which reproduce via spores and can colonize disturbed areas quickly, spread across the landscape. Within a few thousand years, forests began to return. Though they looked different from the ones that had existed before, flowering plants, which had only recently evolved, began to diversify and spread. They were more adaptable than the conifers and ferns that had dominated the Mesozoic, and they thrived in the post-impact world. As plants returned, so did animals. Insects, which had survived in large numbers, began to pollinate the new flowers. Birds, the surviving dinosaurs, diversified into new forms. And mammals, no longer confined to the shadows, began to grow larger and more varied. The world that emerged from the ashes of the Cretaceous was quieter, smaller, and less dominated by reptiles. But it was full of potential. In the silence that followed, in the empty landscapes and the recovering oceans, something small began to rise. The age of dinosaurs was over. For millions of years, mammals were tiny, nocturnal, and cautious. They lived in the shadows of dinosaurs, scurrying through underbrush, hiding in burrows, and venturing out only under the cover of darkness. They weren't apex predators or ecosystem engineers. They were survivors, small and scrappy, doing whatever it took to avoid being stepped on or eaten. But then the dinosaurs vanished, and in the quiet that followed, mammals didn't just survive, they exploded. During the Mesozoic era, the age of dinosaurs, mammals existed but were severely limited. Most were no larger than a rat or a shrew. They had fur to keep warm, specialized teeth for processing different kinds of food, and relatively large brains for their body size. But they couldn't compete with dinosaurs for dominance. Dinosaurs were bigger, faster, and better adapted to the warm climates of the Jurassic and Cretaceous. Mammals carved out niches where dinosaurs didn't venture. The night, the underground, the treetops. These early mammals were insectivores, eating beetles, worms, and other small prey. Some were omnivores, supplementing their diet with seeds, fruits, and plant matter. A few were even carnivorous, hunting other small vertebrates, but none of them were large. The largest known Mesozoic mammal, Repenomamus, was about the size of a badger and weighed around 30 pounds. Fossils show it occasionally ate baby dinosaurs, which is remarkable, but it was the exception, not the rule. Mammals had one major advantage over dinosaurs, though they were warm-blooded, or more accurately, endothermic. This means they could regulate their body temperature internally, rather than relying on the sun to warm them up. Being warm-blooded requires a lot of energy, which is why mammals needed to eat constantly, and why they stayed small. But it also meant they could remain active at night, in cold weather, and in environments where reptiles would become sluggish. When the asteroid struck 66 million years ago and the world plunged into darkness, this trait became crucial: dinosaurs. Even those that may have had some degree of temperature regulation couldn't cope with the prolonged cold and lack of food. Mammals, with their fur, high metabolism, and ability to stay warm in freezing conditions, had a better chance. They could survive on scraps. They could hibernate or slow their metabolism when food was scarce, and they reproduced relatively quickly, which allowed them to adapt to changing conditions faster than larger animals. In the immediate aftermath of the extinction, the world was a grim place. But for mammals, it was also an opportunity. The ecological niches that had been occupied by dinosaurs were suddenly empty. There were no large herbivores grazing in the forests, no massive predators stalking the plains, no armored reptiles dominating the riverbanks. Mammals, which had spent over 100 million years hiding and waiting, finally had room to grow. And grow they did. Within just a few million years, mammals began diversifying at an astonishing rate. By the early Paleocene, around 60 million years ago, mammals had already evolved into forms recognizable as the ancestors of modern groups. There were early primates, small, tree-dwelling creatures with grasping hands and forward-facing eyes. There were rodents, which would go on to become the most diverse group of mammals on Earth. There were early ungulates, hoofed animals that would eventually evolve into horses, deer, and cows. Around 50 million years ago, a group of hoofed mammals began spending more time in rivers and coastal waters, hunting fish and aquatic prey. Over millions of years, their bodies adapted. Their legs became flippers. Their nostrils moved to the top of their heads. Their tails flattened into flukes. These were the ancestors of whales and dolphins. It's one of the most dramatic evolutionary transformations ever documented. A land mammal, related to hippos and pigs, became a fully aquatic creature capable of diving thousands of feet and holding its breath for over an hour. Other mammals took to the skies. Bats appeared around 50 to 55 million years ago, the only mammals to evolve true powered flight. Their wings are modified hands, with elongated fingers connected by a thin membrane of skin. They developed echolocation, using sound waves to navigate and hunt in complete darkness. This allowed them to occupy a niche that no other mammal could access, the nocturnal aerial insect predator. On land, mammals grew larger. By the Eocene, around 50 million years ago, there were mammalian herbivores the size of rhinos and predators the size of bears. Andrewsarchus, one of the largest land-dwelling carnivorous mammals, had a skull over 3 feet long and was likely an apex predator in its environment. Indracotherium, a relative of modern rhinos, stood over 16 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed around 15 tons, making it one of the largest land mammals ever to exist. Why did mammals grow so large? Part of it was the absence of competition. Without dinosaurs, there was nothing to stop mammals from filling the roles of large herbivores and predators. But size also has advantages. Larger animals are more efficient at regulating body temperature because they lose heat more slowly. They can defend themselves more effectively. They can access food sources that smaller animals can't reach. And in ecosystems where predation pressure is high, being big can be a survival strategy. Mammals also developed more complex brains, the neocortex. The part of the brain responsible for higher-order thinking expanded significantly in mammals compared to reptiles. This allowed for more sophisticated behaviors, problem-solving, social learning, communication. Many mammals began living in groups, forming social structures that provided protection, improved hunting success, and facilitated the raising of young. One of the most important mammalian traits is parental care. Unlike most reptiles, which lay eggs and leave them to hatch on their own, Mammals invest heavily in their offspring. They give birth to live young, which are often helpless at birth and require extended care. Mothers produce milk, a nutrient-rich fluid that provides everything a growing infant needs. This extended parental investment means fewer offspring but higher survival rates for those that are born. Mammals also evolved diverse reproductive strategies. Monotremes, like the platypus and echidna, lay eggs but still produce milk. Marsupials, like kangaroos and opossums, give birth to underdeveloped young that complete their development in a pouch. Placental mammals, the largest group, nourish their young inside the womb through a placenta, allowing for longer gestation periods and more developed offspring at birth. By the end of the Paleogene period, around 23 million years ago, mammals had become the dominant large animals on every continent. They had adapted to deserts, forests, grasslands, mountains, oceans, and rivers. They had evolved into herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and insectivores. They had developed flight, echolocation, complex social behaviors, and advanced cognitive abilities. The small, cautious creatures that once hid from dinosaurs had become the rulers of a new world. And among those mammals, one lineage was about to make a leap that would change everything. A group of primates living in the forests of Africa was beginning to experiment with something no other animal had fully mastered: walking upright on two legs. The meek didn't just inherit the earth, they redesigned it, and soon one branch of that family tree would start walking in a way that would lead, eventually, to you lying here tonight. Standing on two legs seems natural now. You do it without thinking, dozens of times a day. You stand to stretch, to reach for something on a shelf, to walk from one room to another. But bipedalism, walking upright on two legs, was a risky, painful experiment. It changed the shape of our skeletons, altered how we give birth, and gave us chronic back pain that follows us into old age. And yet, it was one of the most important adaptations in human evolution. The decision to stand up, made by our ancestors millions of years ago, set us on a path that would eventually lead to language, tools, culture, and everything that makes us human. Let's go back to Africa, around 7 million years ago. The continent was covered in dense forests, and our ancestors were primates, closely related to modern chimpanzees and gorillas. They lived in trees, moving through the canopy using all four limbs, knuckle walking on the ground, swinging from branches, climbing with powerful arms and grasping hands. This lifestyle worked well in the forest. But the climate was changing. Africa was becoming drier. Forests were shrinking, replaced by open woodlands and eventually vast savannas. As the trees disappeared, some primates adapted by staying in the remaining forests. Those lineages became modern chimpanzees and gorillas. But others began spending more time on the ground, moving between scattered trees in search of food. And at some point, some of these ground-dwelling primates began to stand upright more frequently. Not all the time, but enough that natural selection started favoring individuals who were better at it. The earliest evidence of bipedalism comes from a species called Sahelanthropus tchadensis, which lived around 7 million years ago. We don't have much of its skeleton, mostly just a skull, but the position of the foramen magnum, the hole where the spine connects to the skull, suggests it might have walked upright at least part of the time. In quadrupedal animals, this hole is at the back of the skull. In bipedal animals, it's centered underneath, allowing the head to balance on top of the spine. A few million years later, around 4.5 million years ago, we have more definitive evidence. Ardipithecus ramidus had a foot structure that suggests it could walk upright, though it still spent a lot of time in trees. Its big toe was slightly divergent, like a thumb, which helped with climbing, but its pelvis and leg bones show adaptations for upright walking. It was transitional, caught between two worlds. Then came the Australopithecines, and with them, clear evidence of committed bipedalism. The most famous example is Lucy, a skeleton of Australopithecus afarensis discovered in Ethiopia in 1974. Lucy lived about 3.2 million years ago, and her skeleton tells us a lot about how early hominins walked. Her pelvis was short and broad, which provided support for walking upright. Her femur, the thigh bone, angled inward toward the knee, which is essential for balancing on two legs, and her foot had a well-developed arch, which acts like a spring to absorb shock with each step. But Lucy's skeleton also shows the costs of bipedalism. Her spine had a pronounced curve, similar to ours, which helps distribute weight but also creates stress points that lead to back pain. Her pelvis, while adapted for walking, was narrower than a quadruped's, which made childbirth more difficult, and her knees and hips bore the full weight of her body with every step, leading to wear and tear over time. So why stand up at all? What were the advantages that outweighed these significant costs? One theory is that bipedalism allowed early hominins to see over tall grass. On the open savanna, being able to spot predators or locate food from a distance was crucial for survival. Standing upright gave them a better vantage point than walking on all fours. Another advantage was freeing the hands. When you walk on two legs, your hands are no longer needed for locomotion. This allowed early hominins to carry things, food, tools, infants. The ability to transport resources over long distances would have been a game changer, enabling them to gather food in one location and bring it back to a safe place to eat. Bipedalism is also more energy efficient over long distances. Walking on two legs uses less energy than knuckle walking, especially when traveling across open terrain. Early hominins could cover more ground with less effort, which was important in an environment where food and water sources were spread out. This efficiency may have also played a role in endurance hunting, a strategy where humans chase prey over long distances until the animal collapses from exhaustion. There's also a thermoregulation theory. Standing upright reduces the amount of body surface exposed to the sun during the hottest part of the day. When the sun is directly overhead, a bipedal body presents a smaller target than a quadrupedal one. This would have helped early hominins stay cooler while foraging in open environments. Additionally, standing lifts the body higher off the hot ground, where temperatures can be significantly higher, and exposes it to cooler breezes. But bipedalism came with serious trade-offs. The human spine, with its shaped curve, is prone to problems. Lower back pain is incredibly common because the spine is supporting weight vertically in a way it wasn't originally designed for. Our ancestors walked on all fours for millions of years, and the transition to upright posture was recent in evolutionary terms. The spine is still adapting. Childbirth became more dangerous. A narrow pelvis is better for walking efficiently, but it makes passing a baby's head through the birth canal much more difficult. Human infants are born more helpless than the young of most other mammals because they have to be born earlier, before their heads grow too large to fit through the pelvis. This means human babies require extended parental care, which has shaped our social structures and development. Our knees and hips also suffer. These joints bear the full weight of the body with every step, and over a lifetime, this leads to arthritis and joint degeneration. Quadrupeds distribute their weight across 4 limbs, which reduces stress on any single joint. Bipeds don't have that luxury. Despite these costs, bipedalism was a success. Australopithecines like Lucy thrived for millions of years. They walked across Africa, adapted to different environments, and eventually gave rise to the genus Homo, our direct ancestors. By 2 million years ago, species like Homo habilis and Homo erectus were not only walking upright, but doing so with efficiency and endurance that rivaled any modern human. Homo erectus, in particular, was a remarkable walker. Fossils show long, strong leg bones and a pelvis almost identical to ours. These hominins could walk and run for hours, covering dozens of miles in a single day. They migrated out of Africa and spread across Asia and Europe, a feat that would have been impossible without the endurance that bipedalism provided. Walking upright also changed how we interact with the world. It freed our hands to make tools, carry food, and gesture. It allowed us to see further, travel longer, and think differently. And it set the stage for another evolutionary leap, one that would define our species more than any other trait: the growth of the brain. We traded stability for possibility, and it changed everything. But the brain that would soon expand inside our skulls came with its own costs and its own extraordinary gifts. Your brain uses 20% of your energy. That's expensive. Most organs use far less. Your heart, around 7%, your kidneys about 10%. But your brain, sitting quietly inside your skull, demands a fifth of everything you consume. Evolution had to have a reason. A brain this large, this hungry, this metabolically demanding, wouldn't exist unless it provided a massive survival advantage. And the story of how our minds became human is one of the most remarkable chapters in evolutionary history. 2 million years ago, our ancestors had brains about the size of a chimpanzee's, roughly 400 cubic centimeters. That's small compared to the modern human brain, which averages around 1,350 cubic centimeters. But those early hominins were already doing something no other primate had mastered. They were making tools, simple stone flakes, sharp enough to cut meat and scrape hides. These weren't accidental. They required planning, precision, and the ability to visualize a finished product before it existed. The species responsible for these early tools was Homo habilis, which means handy man. Homo habilis lived in East Africa between 2.4 and 1.4 million years ago, and its brain was slightly larger than earlier Australopithecines, around 600 cubic centimeters. That extra brain size, even a modest increase, translated into new cognitive abilities. Better hand-eye coordination, improved problem-solving, the capacity to teach others and learn complex skills. But the real explosion in brain size began with Homo erectus around 1.9 million years ago. Homo erectus had a brain of about 900 cubic centimeters, and it grew larger over time. This species wasn't just making tools, it was controlling fire. Fire changed everything. It provided warmth, protection from predators, and most importantly, it allowed cooking. Cooking breaks down tough plant fibers and denatures proteins, making food easier to digest and increasing the number of calories the body can extract. This is crucial because brains are expensive. They require glucose, a type of sugar, to function, and they burn through it fast. A larger brain needs a steady supply of high-quality, calorie-dense food. Raw food, especially raw plant matter, takes a long time to digest and doesn't provide as many usable calories. Cooked food is more efficient, in faster and elating. it delivers more energy with less digestive effort, and that surplus energy could be diverted to building and maintaining a larger brain. There's a trade-off, though. As the brain grew larger, the gut got smaller. Primates typically have long digestive tracts to process fibrous plant material, but humans have relatively short guts compared to other primates our size. We outsource some of our digestion to fire. Instead of spending hours chewing and fermenting plant matter in our stomachs, we cooked it first, breaking it down before it even entered our mouths. This allowed us to reduce the size and energy cost of our digestive system and invest that energy into the brain instead. By 500,000 years ago, the brain size of our ancestors was approaching modern levels. Homo heidelbergensis, a likely ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans, had a brain around 1,200 cubic centimeters. These hominins lived in complex social groups, hunted large game, and possibly used language or proto-language to communicate. Their skulls show a more rounded shape, which accommodates the expansion of the frontal lobes, the part of the brain responsible for planning, decision-making, and social reasoning. Neanderthals, who appeared around 400,000 years ago, had brains that were actually slightly larger than ours, averaging around 1,400 to 1,500 cubic centimeters. They were intelligent, capable toolmakers who buried their dead, cared for the injured, and adapted to harsh Ice Age climates. The size of their brains wasn't what set modern humans apart. It was how the brain was organized and what it allowed us to do. Modern Homo sapiens appeared around 300,000 years ago in Africa. Our brains are not just large, but structured differently. We have a more pronounced prefrontal cortex, which is involved in abstract thinking, planning for the future, and understanding complex social dynamics. We also have a larger temporal lobe, which processes language, and a more developed parietal lobe, which integrates sensory information and supports spatial reasoning. One of the most important developments was language. No one knows exactly when language evolved, but by 50,000 years ago, modern humans were producing art, music, symbolic objects, and complex tools that required step-by-step instruction to make. These activities suggest fully developed language. Language isn't just about communication. It allows us to share knowledge across generations, to teach complex skills, to tell stories that convey abstract concepts like morality and identity. Language also enables cooperation on a scale no other species achieves. Humans can work together in groups of hundreds or thousands because we can create shared myths, laws, and cultural norms. We can coordinate hunting strategies, divide labor, and plan for the future. This ability to cooperate flexibly and at scale is one of the key reasons humans have been so successful. Art is another uniquely human trait tied to brain development. The oldest known cave paintings are around 45,000 years old, found in Indonesia and Europe. These aren't just random marks. They're representations of animals, human hands, and abstract symbols. Creating art requires imagination, the ability to hold an image in your mind and translate it into a physical form. It requires fine motor control, planning, and an understanding that a mark on a wall can represent something else. This kind of symbolic thinking is rare in the animal kingdom. Culture, too, is a product of our large brains. Culture is the accumulation of knowledge, practices, and beliefs passed down through generations. It allows humans to adapt to new environments without waiting for biological evolution. If you move to a cold climate, you don't need to evolve fur over thousands of generations. You learn to make clothing, build shelters, and control fire. Culture accelerates adaptation and makes humans incredibly versatile. But all of this cognitive power comes at a cost. Human infants are born with large heads, which makes childbirth difficult and dangerous. To fit through the birth canal, babies are born earlier in their development than other primates. A newborn human is essentially helpless. It can't walk, can't feed itself, can't even hold its head up. It requires years of intensive care. This extended childhood is necessary because the brain continues to grow and develop outside the womb, a process that takes over 20 years to complete. Sleep plays a crucial role in brain development and maintenance. During sleep, especially during REM sleep, the brain consolidates memories, processes emotions, and clears out metabolic waste. The brain is so active during sleep that it sometimes uses more energy than when you're awake. Without adequate sleep, the brain can't perform essential maintenance, and cognitive function declines rapidly. Your brain also never stops working. Even when you're lying here trying to fall asleep, it's processing the day's events, organizing memories, and preparing for tomorrow. The default mode network, a collection of brain regions that activate when you're not focused on the outside world, is busy making connections, solving problems, and generating thoughts. This is why your mind sometimes races at night. Your brain is doing what it evolved to do: think, plan, worry, imagine. The human brain is a marvel of evolution. It allowed us to create tools, language, art, and culture. It enabled us to cooperate, adapt, and eventually dominate every environment on Earth. But it also gave us anxiety, existential dread, and the ability to lie awake at 3 in the morning overthinking things that don't matter. It's powerful and exhausting in equal measure. We didn't just survive, we imagined, and that made us unstoppable. But the brain that built civilizations also needed rest, and the way we sleep today carries echoes of survival strategies refined over millions of years. 20,000 years ago, Earth was locked in ice. Glaciers covered large parts of North America, Europe, and Asia, some over a mile thick. Sea levels dropped by over 400 feet as water became trapped in ice sheets. The climate was harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving, and humans, still a relatively young species, nearly didn't make it. This was the last glacial maximum, the coldest and most extreme phase of the most recent ice age, and survival required every adaptation, every bit of ingenuity, every ounce of cooperation that evolution had given us. The Pleistocene epoch, which lasted from about 2.6 million to 11,700 years ago, was characterized by repeated cycles of glaciation. Ice ages came and went, driven by subtle changes in Earth's orbit and axial tilt. These cycles, known as Milankovitch cycles, affected how much sunlight reached different parts of the planet and triggered the expansion and retreat of ice sheets. The last glacial maximum, around 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, was the peak of the most recent cycle. During this time, temperatures were on average about 10 to 15 degrees Celsius colder than today. That might not sound like much, but it was enough to fundamentally alter the planet's ecosystems. Forests retreated, grasslands expanded, deserts grew. Much of the northern hemisphere was buried under ice. In places like Scandinavia, ice sheets were over 2 miles thick. Even areas that weren't directly covered by glaciers experienced permafrost, ground that remained frozen year-round. For humans, this was a crisis. Our species, Homo sapiens, had evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago and had begun migrating out of Africa around 70,000 years ago. By the time the last glacial maximum hit, humans were spread across Africa, Asia, Europe, and had even reached Australia. but populations were small, scattered, and vulnerable. Genetic studies suggest that the human population may have dropped to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals during this period. We were on the brink. Why did numbers drop so low? Food scarcity was a major factor. Cold temperatures meant shorter growing seasons and less plant productivity. Large herbivores like mammoths, bison, and reindeer were still around, but they were harder to hunt in the extreme cold. Water sources froze. Firewood became scarce in treeless tundra, and competition with other predators, including saber-toothed cats, cave bears, and Neanderthals, added to the pressure. Neanderthals, who had lived in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, went extinct around 40,000 years ago, possibly due to a combination of climate stress, competition with modern humans, and genetic isolation. Their disappearance left Homo sapiens as the only remaining human species, but it didn't make survival any easier. So, how did humans survive? The answer lies in a combination of biological adaptations, technological innovation, and social cooperation. First, clothing. We lost most of our body hair during our evolution in Africa, likely as an adaptation to help with cooling during endurance hunting. But in the Ice Age, that lack of insulation became a liability. So we invented clothing. Early humans used animal skins, stitched together with bone needles and sinew, to create tailored garments that trapped body heat. Archaeological evidence shows bone needles dating back over 30,000 years, indicating that humans were making fitted clothing long before the last glacial maximum. This wasn't just wrapping hides around the body. It was sophisticated tailoring, creating layers, insulating boots, hoods, and gloves that protected against frostbite. Fire was equally critical. Humans had been using fire for hundreds of thousands of years, but during the Ice Age, it became essential for survival. Fire provided warmth, light, protection from predators, and a way to cook food, which made it easier to digest and increased caloric intake. Archaeological sites from this period show hearths, fire pits, and evidence of controlled burning. Some groups even learned to carry fire with them, using smoldering embers transported in containers made of bark or hide. Shelter also evolved. In the harsh climates of Ice Age, Europe, and Asia, caves provided natural protection, but they weren't always available. So humans built shelters from mammoth bones, covered with hides and insulated with earth and vegetation. Some of these structures were surprisingly complex, with multiple rooms, storage pits, and central hearths. They represented not just survival, but planning and engineering. Cooperation was another key to survival. Humans lived in small, tightly knit groups, typically extended families or clans of 20 to 50 individuals. These groups shared resources, coordinated hunts, and cared for the young, the sick, and the elderly. Social bonds weren't just cultural, they were survival strategies. A group could accomplish what an individual could not, bringing down large game, defending territory, and pooling knowledge about food sources and dangers. Language played a critical role in this cooperation. The ability to communicate complex ideas, share information about animal migrations, teach tool-making techniques, and pass down knowledge across generations gave humans an edge over other species. Stories, myths, and oral traditions helped bind groups together and provided frameworks for understanding the world. Humans also demonstrated remarkable adaptability. When traditional food sources became scarce, they adapted. They fished, gathered shellfish, collected bird eggs, and hunted smaller game. They learned to read the landscape, tracking animal movements, predicting weather patterns, and identifying edible plants. This flexibility, the ability to shift strategies based on changing conditions, was crucial. Migration was another survival strategy. As ice sheets advanced, humans moved. They followed herds of animals to more hospitable regions. They crossed land bridges created by lower sea levels. During the last glacial maximum, much of the world's water was locked up in ice, which exposed land that is now underwater. The Bering Land Bridge, connecting Asia and North America, allowed humans to migrate into the Americas around 15,000 years ago. Similarly, lower sea levels in Southeast Asia created land connections that allowed humans to reach Australia much earlier, around 65,000 years ago. But migration wasn't always possible. Some populations became isolated by ice sheets, mountain ranges, or vast deserts. These isolated groups developed distinct cultures, languages, and genetic traits. Genetic studies show that many modern human populations carry traces of this bottleneck period, evidence of small, isolated groups that survived and eventually expanded when conditions improved. As the climate began to warm around 19,000 years ago, ice sheets started to retreat, sea levels rose, forests returned. Animals that had adapted to cold climates, like woolly mammoths and giant ground sloths, began to decline, partly due to climate change and partly due to hunting pressure from expanding human populations. By 11,700 years ago, the Pleistocene had ended, and the Holocene, the current interglacial period, had begun. This warming allowed human populations to grow and spread. Agriculture emerged around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, transforming human societies from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. With agriculture came villages, then cities, then civilizations. The survival strategies that had carried humans through the Ice Age, cooperation, innovation, adaptability, became the foundation for everything that followed. But the Ice Age left its mark. Humans today still carry genetic adaptations that helped our ancestors survive. Some populations developed lighter skin to better synthesize vitamin D in low sunlight environments. Others developed more efficient fat storage to survive periods of scarcity. And our brains, shaped by the need to solve problems and cooperate under extreme stress, retained the plasticity and creativity that defined Ice Age survival. We endured the cold, and when the ice melted, we spread everywhere. But the adaptations that helped us survive left us with bodies and minds still tuned to a world that no longer exists, including the way we sleep. Almost every mammal is covered in fur. Dogs have it, cats have it, bears, monkeys, elephants, even whales have sparse hair scattered across their skin. But you, lying there under your blankets, are essentially naked. You have hair on your head, some on your face and body, but compared to other primates, you're almost completely bare. This wasn't always the case. Our ancestors were covered in thick body hair, just like chimpanzees and gorillas. So what happened? Why did humans lose their fur, and how did we survive without it? The story begins around 1 to 2 million years ago in Africa, when our ancestors were transitioning from forest-dwelling primates to savanna-adapted hominins. Early hominins, like Australopithecus, were likely covered in body hair similar to modern ape. But as the genus Homo evolved, particularly with species like Homo erectus, something changed. They began losing their thick fur and developing a new adaptation that would prove crucial for survival in hot, open environments: sweat glands. Humans have between 2 and 5 million sweat glands distributed across our bodies, far more than most other mammals. These glands produce sweat, a mixture of water, salt, and other compounds, which evaporates from the skin and cools the body. Evaporative cooling is incredibly efficient, much more so than panting, which is how most furry mammals cool themselves. But here's the catch. Sweat only works effectively if it can evaporate. Thick fur traps moisture against the skin and prevents evaporation. So, as our ancestors developed more sweat glands, natural selection favored individuals with less body hair. Why was cooling so important? The leading theory is endurance hunting. Early humans didn't have the speed or strength to overpower large prey. They couldn't outrun a gazelle or wrestle down a wildebeest, but they had something no other predator had: the ability to run for hours without overheating. Most mammals, especially large ones, overheat quickly during sustained physical activity. A cheetah can sprint at 70 miles per hour, but only for about 30 seconds before it has to stop and cool down. A human, on the other hand, can jog at a steady pace for hours, even in the midday heat. This stamina allowed early humans to practice persistence hunting, chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion and heat stress. The animal would run, stop to cool down, run again, and eventually, after hours of pursuit, it would be too exhausted to continue. The human hunters, sweating profusely but still mobile, could close in and make the kill. This hunting strategy was used by some indigenous groups well into the modern era, including the San people of southern Africa. But endurance hunting only works if you can stay cool, and staying cool requires bare skin and lots of sweat. So over hundreds of thousands of years, humans lost most of their body hair. We retained hair on our heads, which provides shade and protects the brain from direct sunlight. We kept eyebrows, which channel sweat away from the eyes, and we kept hair in areas like the armpits and groin, possibly because these areas have specialized scent glands that play a role in social and sexual communication. There's another theory for why humans lost their fur, and it has to do with parasites. Body hair is a haven for lice, fleas, ticks, and other ectoparasites. These pests not only cause discomfort but can also transmit diseases. Reducing body hair would have reduced the habitat available for parasites, making humans less vulnerable to infection. This theory is supported by the fact that humans have 3 distinct species of lice: head lice, body lice, and pubic lice, each adapted to different parts of the body. The divergence of these species suggests that humans lost most of their body hair, but retained enough in specific areas for different lice populations to survive. Losing fur had consequences, though, without a layer of insulation, humans became vulnerable to cold. In temperate and Arctic climates, bare skin is a liability. This is where cultural adaptations came in. Humans developed clothing, shelters, and controlled fire, all of which provided artificial insulation. Unlike biological traits, which take thousands of generations to evolve, cultural adaptations can be developed and transmitted within a single lifetime. This allowed humans to spread into cold climates without waiting for evolution to give them fur again. Bare skin also meant increased vulnerability to sunlight. In Africa, where humans evolved, intense UV radiation from the sun can damage skin cells and lead to skin cancer. To protect against this, early humans developed high levels of melanin, the pigment that darkens skin. Melanin acts as a natural sunscreen, absorbing UV radiation and preventing it from penetrating deeper layers of skin. This is why populations that evolved near the equator, where UV radiation is strongest, tend to have darker skin. As humans migrated out of Africa and into regions with less intense sunlight, the selective pressure changed. In northern latitudes, UV radiation is weaker, and melanin, while protective, can actually be a disadvantage. The body needs UV radiation to synthesize vitamin D, which is essential for bone health, immune function, and other physiological processes. Too much melanin in low UV environments can lead to vitamin D deficiency. Over thousands of years, populations in Europe and Northern Asia evolved lighter skin, which allowed them to produce sufficient vitamin D even with limited sunlight. This is a clear example of natural selection acting on humans in relatively recent evolutionary time. Skin color is one of the traits that vary most between human populations, and it's a direct adaptation to local UV levels. It's also a trait with no connection to any other biological or cognitive characteristics, a reminder that human variation is primarily about geography and climate, not fundamental differences. Bare skin also made humans more sensitive to touch. Without a layer of fur, our skin became a highly sensitive organ, capable of detecting subtle changes in temperature, texture, and pressure. This increased sensitivity may have played a role in social bonding. Touch, grooming, and physical closeness became important ways for humans to communicate trust and affection. In other primates, grooming serves this function, picking through fur to remove parasites and dirt. Humans, lacking dense fur, developed other forms of social touch, holding hands, hugging, patting backs, all of which release oxytocin and strengthen social bonds. Today, we live in climate-controlled environments. We have heating, air conditioning, and clothing for every weather condition. We've effectively removed the selective pressures that shaped our ancestors. But our biology still reflects those ancient adaptations. We sweat more than any other primate. We have relatively hairless bodies, and we're still vulnerable to temperature extremes, despite our technological insulation. Interestingly, the way we regulate temperature affects how we sleep. Your body temperature naturally drops at night, signaling to your brain that it's time to sleep. This drop is part of your circadian rhythm, the internal clock that governs sleep-wake cycles. If your environment is too warm, your body can't cool down effectively, and sleep becomes difficult. This is why a cool bedroom, usually between 60 to 67 degrees Fahrenheit, is ideal for sleep. It allows your body to reach the lower temperature needed for deep, restorative rest. We became vulnerable, but we adapted with tools, not traits. And the bare skin that once helped us hunt across savannas now reminds us, every cold night, that we're still the species that chose flexibility over armor. Almost every mammal is covered in fur, thick, insulating coats that protect against cold, shield from the sun, and provide camouflage. Wolves have it, bears have it, even whales have remnants of it during fetal development. But you, lying there under your blanket, are almost completely naked. A few sparse patches on your head, under your arms, and in a few other places, but otherwise bare skin. This makes humans unusual, almost unique among mammals, and the story of why we lost our fur is tied to one of the most important survival strategies our ancestors ever developed: the ability to run. Our early ancestors, the Australopithecines, likely had fur similar to modern chimpanzees, not as thick as a gorilla's, but enough to provide some protection from the elements. They lived in forests and woodlands where temperature regulation wasn't a major challenge. Shade was abundant, water was nearby, and they didn't need to travel long distances in open sunlight. But as the climate changed and forests gave way to savannas, hominins began spending more time in open environments. Around 2 million years ago, with the appearance of Homo erectus, something shifted. These hominins were taller, leaner, and had longer legs than their predecessors. Their body proportions suggest they were adapted for walking and running long distances in hot, open environments. And at some point during this transition, they began losing their fur. Why would losing fur be advantageous? The answer is heat. Walking or running in the African sun generates enormous amounts of heat, especially over long distances. Fur is an excellent insulator, which is great in cold climates, but problematic in hot ones. It traps heat close to the body, making it harder to cool down. For an animal that needs to stay active in the middle of the day, overheating is a serious risk. Humans solved this problem by evolving one of the most efficient cooling systems in the animal kingdom: sweating. Most mammals can sweat to some degree, but humans have an extraordinary number of sweat glands, between 2 and 4 million, covering almost the entire body. These glands produce a watery fluid that evaporates from the skin, carrying heat away and cooling the body. It's remarkably effective, but it only works if the sweat can evaporate. Fur blocks evaporation, so losing fur made sweating far more efficient. This adaptation allowed early humans to do something almost no other predator could: hunt during the hottest part of the day. Most large predators, like lions and leopards, are ambush hunters. They rely on short bursts of speed to catch prey, but they overheat quickly and need to rest in the shade during midday. Humans, on the other hand, could pursue prey for hours under the blazing sun, tracking animals until they collapsed from heat exhaustion. This strategy, called persistence hunting, is still practiced by some hunter-gatherer groups today. Persistence hunting works because humans have superior endurance and thermoregulation. A human can run or jog for hours, maintaining a steady pace, while most animals, even fast ones like antelope, overheat after just 15 to 20 minutes of exertion. They're covered in fur, and they don't sweat efficiently. Dogs pant, which cools them down but requires them to stop running. Humans can cool down while still moving. This gives us an enormous advantage over long distances. But losing fur came with trade-offs. Without a thick coat, early humans became vulnerable to sunburn, cold nights, and skin injuries. The solution to sunburn was melanin, the pigment that gives skin its color. Populations living near the equator, where UV radiation is strongest, evolved darker skin with higher melanin content. Melanin absorbs and dissipates UV radiation, protecting the skin from damage and reducing the risk of skin cancer. Darker skin was a direct adaptation to living without fur in intense sunlight. As humans migrated to higher latitudes, where sunlight is less intense, the selective pressure for dark skin decreased. In fact, lighter skin became advantageous because it allowed for more efficient production of vitamin D. Vitamin D is synthesized in the skin when it's exposed to UV radiation, and it's essential for bone health and immune function. In low sunlight environments, dark skin can block too much UV, leading to vitamin D deficiency. Lighter skin, with less melanin, allows more UV to penetrate and produce adequate vitamin D even in cloudy northern climates. Cold was another challenge. Without fur, humans needed alternative ways to stay warm. Clothing became essential, as we discussed earlier. But humans also evolved some physiological adaptations. Subcutaneous fat, a layer of fat just beneath the skin, provides insulation and helps retain body heat. While not as effective as fur, it's enough to make a difference, especially when combined with behavioral adaptations like huddling together for warmth and building fires. Interestingly, humans retained hair in a few key areas. The hair on your head provides some protection from the sun, reducing heat absorption and shielding the scalp. Eyebrows prevent sweat from dripping into your eyes. Eyelashes protect against dust and debris. And pubic and underarm hair may play roles in scent distribution and reducing friction. These patches of hair aren't random. They serve specific functions that outweighed the benefits of removing them. There's also a theory that hairlessness made it harder for parasites to thrive. Lice, ticks, and fleas live in fur, and they can carry diseases. By losing most of our body hair, humans may have reduced their exposure to these parasites. However, we didn't lose them entirely. Human lice evolved into 3 distinct types: head lice, body lice, and pubic lice, each adapted to the remaining patches of hair on our bodies. Body lice, which live in clothing rather than on the body, only appeared after humans started wearing clothes, suggesting that our hairlessness and clothing co-evolved. Losing fur also had social and sexual implications. Without fur, skin became a canvas for communication. Blushing, for example, is a uniquely human trait. When we're embarrassed, blood rushes to the face, making it turn red. This visible signal is only possible because we don't have fur covering our faces. Similarly, changes in skin tone due to health, emotion, or arousal became more visible, providing subtle cues during social interactions. Naked skin also became a factor in mate selection. Smooth, healthy skin may have been an indicator of youth, health, and genetic fitness. Scars, blemishes, and skin conditions became visible, possibly influencing reproductive choices. This isn't to say appearance was the only factor. Cooperation, intelligence, and resource provision were likely just as important. But visible health markers on hairless skin could have played a role. Today, the lack of fur is so normal to us that we rarely think about it. But it's one of the defining features of being human. It's why you sweat during a workout, why you need sunscreen at the beach, why you feel cold when you step out of a warm shower, why you can blush, bruise, and tan. Your naked skin is an evolutionary adaptation for endurance, for running under the sun, for hunting when no other predator could. But it also makes you vulnerable. You need clothing, shelter, and fire to survive in most climates. You're more susceptible to cuts, burns, and infections than a furred animal would be. You've traded biological protection for adaptability and endurance, and that trade, made by your ancestors millions of years ago, is why you're here tonight, covered in blankets instead of fur. We became vulnerable, but we adapted with tools, not traits, and soon those tools would help us master the one biological necessity that every living creature shares, the need to sleep. Evolution hasn't stopped. You are not the final draft. Right now, as you lie here, your body carries genes that are still being tested, still being selected for or against, still responding to the pressures of the modern world. The human species is still evolving, just not in the dramatic, visible ways we might imagine. No wings are sprouting, no gills are forming, but subtle changes are happening, and they're shaping what humans will become in the millennia ahead. Evolution works on timescales that are hard to grasp. Most of the changes we've discussed tonight took millions of years, but some evolutionary shifts can happen much faster, especially when selective pressures are strong. And humans have experienced some of these rapid changes within just the last 10,000 years, since the advent of agriculture. One of the clearest examples is lactose tolerance. For most of human history, adults couldn't digest milk. Lactose, the sugar found in milk, requires an enzyme called lactase to break it down. Infants produce lactase because they need to digest their mother's milk, but in most mammals, lactase production shuts down after weaning. Drinking milk as an adult would cause bloating, cramps, and diarrhea. This is still true for the majority of the world's population today. But around 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, some human populations in Europe and parts of Africa began herding cattle, sheep, and goats. Milk became a valuable source of calories and nutrients, especially in environments where other food sources were scarce. Individuals who happened to have a genetic mutation that allowed lactase production to continue into adulthood had a nutritional advantage. They could digest milk without getting sick. They had access to more calories, which meant better health, higher survival rates, and more offspring. Over time, this trait spread through populations that relied on dairy. Today, lactose tolerance is common in Northern Europe, parts of the Middle East, and among some African groups like the Maasai, but it's rare in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and among indigenous populations in the Americas. This is evolution in action, driven by culture and diet, happening over just a few thousand years. Another example is high-altitude adaptation. Populations living in the Andes and the Tibetan Plateau face a unique challenge. At high altitudes, the air contains less oxygen, which makes it harder to breathe and puts stress on the body. Most people who travel to high altitudes experience altitude sickness, headaches, nausea, fatigue, and shortness of breath. But people who have lived at high altitudes for thousands of years have evolved adaptations that help them cope. Tibetans, for example, have genetic variants that increase blood flow and improve oxygen delivery to tissues without raising red blood cell count too high, which can thicken the blood and cause clotting problems. Andean populations, on the other hand, tend to have larger lung capacities and higher red blood cell counts. These are different evolutionary solutions to the same problem, developed independently in populations that have been isolated from each other for millennia. But modern life has introduced new selective pressures, and some of them are radically different from anything humans faced before. Technology, medicine, and social structures have changed the rules of survival. In the past, dying young from infection, injury, or starvation was common. Today, in much of the world, these threats are greatly reduced. Antibiotics treat infections that would have been fatal a century ago. Surgery repairs injuries that would have been disabling. Vaccines prevent diseases that once killed millions. This has weakened some forms of natural selection. Traits that would have been lethal in the past, like poor eyesight or certain genetic disorders, can now be managed with glasses, medication, or surgery. This doesn't mean evolution has stopped. It means the pressures have shifted. Instead of selecting for physical strength or disease resistance, modern environments might select for traits like intelligence, social adaptability, or fertility in resource-rich settings. But there's a catch. Modern life has also introduced health challenges that our bodies aren't adapted for. Sedentary lifestyles, processed foods, artificial light, and chronic stress are all relatively new, and our biology hasn't caught up. We evolved to be active, to eat whole foods, to sleep when it gets dark, and to face short-term stressors like predators or food scarcity, not the prolonged, low-level stress of modern life. This mismatch is why so many people struggle with sleep. Your body is designed to wind down when the sun sets, guided by circadian rhythms that respond to light and darkness. But artificial light, especially blue light from screens, tricks your brain into thinking it's still daytime. Melatonin, the hormone that promotes sleep, is suppressed. Your body stays alert when it should be preparing for rest. This isn't a failure of willpower. It's a conflict between ancient biology and modern behavior. Similarly, the modern diet is filled with foods that trigger reward pathways in the brain: sugar, fat, salt, in concentrations that never existed in nature. Our ancestors evolved to seek out these nutrients because they were rare and valuable, but now they're everywhere, and our brains still respond as if they're scarce. We overeat not because we're weak, but because our biology is optimized for a world that no longer exists. Looking forward, where is evolution taking us? That depends on what pressures shape the next million years. If humans remain on Earth and maintain current lifestyles, some scientists predict we might see changes in vision, possibly adapting to screens and artificial light. Jaw structures might continue to shrink as diets become softer and dental care improves. Height and body proportions could shift based on nutrition and mate selection preferences. But there's also the possibility of something more dramatic. Genetic engineering and technologies like CRISPR allow humans to directly edit genes. This could accelerate evolution in ways that natural selection never could. We could eliminate genetic diseases, enhance physical or cognitive traits, or even introduce entirely new capabilities. If humans colonize other planets, those environments would impose entirely new selective pressures. Lower gravity, different radiation levels, and isolated populations could lead to divergent evolution, creating subspecies adapted to Mars, Europa, or deep space. Artificial intelligence adds another layer of complexity. If AI becomes deeply integrated with human cognition, either through brain-computer interfaces or external augmentation, the definition of what it means to be human could change. Evolution might shift from biological to technological, with intelligence and adaptability enhanced not by genes but by machines. But all of this is speculation. Evolution doesn't have goals. It doesn't plan ahead. It simply responds to whatever pressures exist in the moment. A genetic mutation that seems insignificant today could become crucial if the environment changes. A trait that's advantageous now could become a liability in the future. Evolution is a process of trial and error, played out over generations, with no end point in sight. What we do know is that humans are still changing, slowly, subtly, in ways we might not notice for thousands of years. But the process that shaped your body over 4 billion years hasn't stopped. It's still writing your story, one generation at a time. And here's the thing. Evolution doesn't rush. It unfolds slowly, patiently, like sleep itself. It doesn't force change overnight. It waits, adapts, and finds what works. And maybe that's something you can take with you tonight as you drift off, that you're part of something ancient, something ongoing, something much larger than any single moment of worry or restlessness. You are not separate from this story. You are the story. Every breath you take, every cell in your body, every instinct and impulse, all of it shaped by billions of years of life finding a way. And tonight, as you close your eyes and let go, you're honoring that long, patient process. You're allowing your body to do what it was designed to do: rest, repair, and prepare for another day. Evolution doesn't rush. It unfolds slowly, patiently, like sleep itself. And you, lying here tonight, are proof that patience works. Rest well, you've earned it. So here we are. You've traveled 4 billion years in a single night. From the first breath of oxygen that nearly killed everything, to the Cambrian seas filled with strange and impossible creatures, from the invention of the backbone to the first stumbling steps onto land. You've walked through forests of giants, survived the worst extinction Earth has ever known, and watched dinosaurs rise and fall. You've endured ice ages, lost your fur, stood upright, and grew a brain so large it now keeps you awake at night. That's the irony, isn't it? The same brain that allowed humans to create language, art, tools, and civilization is the one that races when you're trying to sleep. The mind that solves problems for millions of years doesn't know how to turn off when the problems are solved. It keeps running, analyzing, worrying, planning for threats that may never come. Your brain evolved in a world where danger was real and immediate, predators in the dark, scarcity of food, rival groups competing for resources. Vigilance was survival. But now, in the safety of your bed, that vigilance has nowhere to go, so it turns inward. But here's what tonight's journey should remind you. Sleep is not optional. It's not a luxury or a weakness. It's one of the most ancient and essential processes in biology. Sleep exists in nearly every animal with a nervous system, from jellyfish to insects to mammals. It predates language, predates tools, predates walking on land. Your body has been perfecting the art of rest for hundreds of millions of years. It knows what to do. The challenge isn't teaching your body to sleep, it's getting your mind out of the way. Every adaptation you've heard about tonight, breathing oxygen, growing a spine, walking upright, expanding your brain, they all required energy. And sleep is where that energy is managed, restored, and prepared for the next day. During sleep, your body repairs damaged cells, clears metabolic waste from your brain, consolidates memories, and regulates hormones. Your immune system strengthens, your muscles recover, your neurons form new connections. Sleep is when your body does the maintenance work that keeps you functional. And yet, modern life fights against it. Artificial light disrupts your circadian rhythms. Screens flood your brain with stimulation right before bed. Caffeine lingers in your system for hours. Stress keeps your cortisol levels elevated when they should be dropping. You're living in a world that's fundamentally different from the one your biology was designed for, and your sleep suffers because of it. But evolution also gave you adaptability. You can create environments that support sleep instead of fighting it. You can dim the lights an hour before bed, signaling to your brain that day is ending. You can avoid screens, giving your melatonin production a chance to kick in. You can develop routines, consistent bedtimes, calming rituals that help your body recognize it's time to rest. These aren't hacks or shortcuts. They're ways of aligning your modern life with your ancient biology. Think about the mammals that survived the asteroid impact. They were small, adaptable, and patient. They didn't try to fight the new world. They adjusted to it. They found food where they could, sheltered when they needed to, and rested when it was safe. That's what you're doing too. Not surviving an asteroid, but navigating a world that's changing faster than your genes can keep up. And rest, real rest, is part of that adaptation. There's something comforting in knowing that sleep is universal. Dolphins sleep with half their brain at a time so they can keep swimming. Birds can sleep while flying, shutting down one hemisphere while the other stays alert. Even fruit flies have sleep-like states where they become less responsive to stimuli. Sleep is woven into the fabric of life because it works. It's been tested and refined across millions of species and billions of years. You are not broken for needing it. You're participating in one of the oldest biological processes on the planet. And here's the other thing. Evolution didn't create perfect organisms. It created organisms that are good enough to survive and reproduce. Your spine isn't perfect. That's why your back hurts. Your knees aren't perfect. That's why they wear out. Your brain isn't perfect. That's why it keeps you up worrying about things that don't matter. But imperfect doesn't mean failed. It means adapted to a specific set of challenges that your ancestors faced and overcame. You carry their resilience in your DNA. You carry the perseverance of fish that dragged themselves onto land, the endurance of mammals that survived ice ages, the ingenuity of early humans who built fires, made clothing, and crossed continents on foot. You are the result of an unbroken chain of survivors, stretching back to the very first cells that figured out how to replicate themselves in ancient oceans. Every single one of your ancestors lived long enough to reproduce. That's your inheritance. Not perfection, but persistence. So tonight, as you close your eyes, remember that rest is not something you have to earn. It's not something you need to deserve. It's a biological necessity, built into you by evolution itself. Your body knows how to sleep. It's been doing it for hundreds of millions of years. You just need to give it permission. Let go of the idea that you should be more productive, more alert, more anything. You are enough. And right now, the most productive thing you can do is nothing at all. We started tonight by talking about evolution as the slowest, most patient process in the universe. And maybe that's the lesson here. Life doesn't rush. It adapts, it waits, it finds what works. And sleep, at its core, is an act of patience. It's trusting that your body will take care of itself while your mind rests. It's letting go of control and allowing biology to do what it does best. Repair, restore, and prepare. If you enjoyed this journey through the history of life and the science of sleep, I'd love it if you subscribed and shared this with someone who might need it. And if you're still awake, which is perfectly okay, let me know in the comments what surprised you most tonight. Was it the oxygen that nearly killed everything? The giant insects? The fact that your arms were once fins? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear what stuck with you. Before you go, here's one last thought. The next time you're lying awake, frustrated that sleep won't come, try this. Instead of fighting it, just breathe. Slowly, deeply, the way the first organisms learned to breathe oxygen billions of years ago, in and out, in and out. Your body knows this rhythm. It's older than thought, older than worry, older than language. Let it guide you. And trust that sleep, like evolution, works best when you stop trying to force it. You are part of something ancient and ongoing. You are 4 billion years of life, compressed into one fragile, beautiful, imperfect body. And tonight, that body needs rest. So give it what it needs. Let go, breathe, and drift. Good night.